Being in a brand new decade, it's really cool to look back at the previous one and see all the amazing media that released throughout the years. Some that started now iconic franchises, continued others, and even a few that finished in video games, movies, anime, etc. And with that, how it defined the world we live in. It's really interesting to think about. But something else happened in the last decade. Something no one would have expected. Something a lot more distant and neon. Our love affair with the 80s begun. Over 10 years it went from something non-existent to being all over the internet that it's now considered an aesthetic choice for a lot of people and projects. It's now the norm, but why did this happen? What made retro return? To start, we're going to have to explain the music, or well, the modern take of the music. Vaporwave and Synthwave. The first being more inspired by the pop music from that time period, being paired with the soft pastel colors of blues, pinks, and purples. It felt familiar yet non-existent, but at its core fun. The other being Synthwave, that was more inspired by that era sci-fi, what their idea of the future would be, having a more electronic sound paired with the bright neon giving that feel of mysterious cool nightlife. Both aesthetics were incredibly appealing, and with the music would suck you into two different yet idealized versions of the 80s. If you look at the trends over the years, it out of nowhere started to grow. While they are different, they are two sides of the same coin, which is why they are usually mistaken for each other, and because of that I'm using the trend for the term Vaporwave, because both aesthetics are used for it. But that still doesn't explain why they became popular, it just shows the appeal of them. For that, we're gonna have to go back to late 2012, where 3 video games were released really close to each other. The first being Double Dragon Neon, which was a reboot to the iconic beat-em-up franchise that started in the 80s. The second being Retro City Rampage, that released a month later, and only 2 weeks after that, the now iconic original Hotline Miami. While retro-inspired games have always been a thing, they were never like this, being not inspired by the games of those era, rather the era itself. But from the Dre, I want to focus on Hotline Miami, because while the other two had a similar aesthetic, the sound behind them still felt video gamey. If you listen to Double Dragons, it had a cheesy vibe to it, which is what it was going for. And Retro City Rampage was chiptuned to go with the 8-bit graphics, while Hotline Miami had with the electronic synth, it just added to the atmosphere of the game. The warm yet cool neon colors as if it was perpetually sunsetting, with the music captured that feel of clubbing, captured a more colorful and alive world that was always at the brink of ending. It just felt so fun. It's as if someone captured the best parts about that era and turned it into a game. It's how fans of the 80s see the 80s and you were playing it. And with the game being very successful, electronic synths would begin to gain popularity, leading to what we know now as Synthwave. But this wasn't the end of it. A few months later, another game would release, keeping this momentum going. And that game was Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon. Coming right after Far Cry 3, which was incredibly successful, fans wanted more and they had their eyes set on it. Being a standalone game expansion helped even more in broadening the reach of 80s-inspired synth worlds. If Hotline Miami was how fans of the 80s saw the 80s, Blood Dragon was how 80s fans of sci-fi saw sci-fi. But it wouldn't end here, because later in 2013, the Kickstarter for the movie Kung Fury would start, and that would take the same approach but now in film form. But while all this was going on, something else was happening. Vaporwave was in its early years, the first big ones being uploaded 3 years before in late 2010, even having the aesthetic it's known for. As time would go on, other music-based channels would begin to upload the same thing, but they always needed visuals to pair with the audio. Something that goes with the distant cool tones of the Vaporwave that matched the fuzzy dated feel. And while images from that era would work, it wasn't visually engaging. Video loops of commercials and TV shows could get the job done, but there was always something off about them. They needed something that would perfectly match the aesthetic while also having an abundance of it. Something that encapsulates what people love about that era, and if anything is a more perfect version of it that exaggerates the best part about it more than any piece of live action footage could do. '90s anime had everything. From the big poofy hair, the outfits, the soft and cool neon colors, and being the era of cell animation, have the fuzzy feel that was a perfect substitute for the look of old VHS recordings. And being animation made it pretty easy to loop in a seamless, satisfying way. So while the music existed since 2010, the earliest I found of this pairing was January 9th, 2013, with Masismo Michele TDK Everlasting Love Vision on the channel Artsy Music. And over time, they would transition to anime while keeping the pink, blues, and purples. The games, if anything, showed that this was an artistic choice, but it still wasn't well known. They never made the aesthetic and sound popular. They were just planting the seeds in the culture, while the retro anime music was even more underground. There was this whole niche artistic choice lying dormant, just needing one thing to expose it to the masses. And that did happen. The melancholic beat that makes you feel like you're longing for something you know is there, but just don't know what. Something that feels familiar yet foreign, but still hopeful and even a little fun. Like when you remember something small from your past. Home's resonance made you feel so many things, but the main thing was nostalgia. Soft was the beat and cool with the synths, it was Vaporwave at its purest. So when it exploded in popularity all over the internet in 2014, it made people want to find more. And what would they find when searching for these funky, smooth electronic songs? All this old anime that they'd never seen before that looked cool. Retro anime was being exposed to a new massive group of people, and by association, a lot of them would want to know what shows those are. Vaporwave and the aesthetic it's known for was starting to grow in popularity by the end of the previous year into this one until it spiked because of the song. And while it teared off a bit, its impact was already done. And coincidentally, another pillar of the retro anime music pairing would start uploading 5 days later, Triangle Music. Resonance was the catalyst in making it well known, and while it wasn't obvious back then, let's see what happened after 2014. Every year since then, there has been multiple releases of media that had either the neon looks or electronic sound, most usually both. While Hotline Miami 2 and Party Hard obviously weren't the result of the previous year, everything after is more likely. But there is still something bugging me. Why is it that by 2013, coincidentally, there were so many games that had the same inspiration when it wasn't even a thing back then? Something must have come before to set this up. And I do have a theory that might surprise you. Legacy was a massive multi-million-dollar movie that was a loose sequel to the 1982 original. Having the fluorescent colors taking place on the literal grid and with the soundtrack being done by Daft Punk were looked at as the origins of Synthwave, it would only make sense that while the narrative was forgotten, the look and sound is what people remember the most, which is pretty spot on for our current love of the 80s. While the film didn't impact the world as much as Disney wanted, it did make people aware of Tron, and if anything made some check out the original, which just by looking at it, you can see where I'm going with this. It was made in the 80s and took place in a computer. It's the living embodiment of how they thought the future would look like that now doesn't look dated. It's the only thing that adds up. 3 years is enough time for a video game to be developed, and in this case, we got 4 that would get the ball rolling for the inevitable return of retro. I do need to add that Hotline Miami wasn't inspired by Tron, but the 2011 film Drive, so that time frame still adds up. And of course, as more media was being made, others were being inspired by it, continuing the life of the retro art style, to the point where it's now just part of the culture. You see it everywhere on the internet now that you don't even think about it. The 80s is now just considered vaporwave, synthwave, or aesthetic, which is amazing and I'm all down for it. The effects are still echoing to this day in other places too. There's a company that focuses primarily on licensing old school anime, Discotech Media, and while they've operated for years, they've been acquiring more anime than ever, even giving some completely brand new dubs. They're the streaming service that just focuses on these type of anime, Retro Crush. None of this would have ever been possible a decade ago. While actual content from that era is still niche aside from the legacy brands, you can't just escape it because of how it's been transformed and assimilated into the modern culture. You're always aware of the 80s one way or another. While the movie didn't continue the legacy of the Tron franchise, it did continue the legacy of the era it was created in for a whole new generation. And I think it's fair to say, it's pretty great.